What this is about is the greatest ripoff in history, the very way money and debt are created and controlled. This affects everyone on the planet. It is the basic cause of all our economic problems today. Until we recognize this, in every nation, nothing any national government does will fix the problem, and all of us will see mounting debts and sinking standards of living. Our children will inherit this mess, and it will get worse every single year.
This is the first time, I think, in history where mothers are saying to themselves, ooh, what do my kids have to look forward to? Maybe they shouldn't have kids.
The truth is that depressions are not normal. They are contrived. The truth is that nations don't need a national debt. The truth is that governments generally aren't printing money wildly. Governments are borrowing money wildly.
Our money supply has to be borrowed into existence by the community of money users, that's us, from the commercial banks.
The bulk of money creation is made by banks.
The banks decide when and how much money they are going to produce, so to say. The money supply is out of control, out of any control.
When governments today, they borrow money from the banks, basically you are just enslaving the rest of the economy, the people.
You need to create the money for the good of the people. It has to be a common good.
The banks have usurped that prerogative of creating money.
The problem is that we've given the power to create money to the banking sector, and we've let them use that power more or less unrestrained.
The new money coming into the economy starts as debt created by the banks, and it's unsustainable.
The way the system is going now, that either wittingly or otherwise, it is going to destroy Western civilization as we have known it for the last century.
Interest on a loan is reaping where you do not sow.
It's legalized theft. Legalized theft is what we now have with this monetary system.
This is quite different from the past, when money was created by the government.
There is no reason for governments to run the debt. It's a game of power, really.
The normal American citizen is becoming poorer and poorer, and the world economy is collapsing.
The good news is we can fix this. It won't take a war or a revolution. It only takes a simple understanding of the problem and its simple solution. The truth is that anyone can understand what's going on. This is not rocket science. The truth is that those who are making money off this ripoff want to keep you confused. Confused about the basic facts of what your money is and who creates it. By 1907, Morgan and the other money changers had had enough. First, they created a panic by attacking Morgan's primary Wall Street rival, the Heinz-Morse Group, the holders of considerable banking, mining, steel, and shipping interests. By cleverly manipulating the stock market, the Rockefellers drove down the stock of Heinz's Union Copper Company from as high as $60 a share down to $10 a share. In addition, Rockefeller spread the rumor that not only were Heinz copper interests in trouble, but also Heinz banks as well. J.P. Morgan then jumped in, predicting that he thought the Knickerbocker Trust Company would be the first Heinz bank to go under. As historian Skousen explained,
that was all it took to send depositors storming to the tellers' cages of the Knickerbocker Bank to get their money. Within a few days, the bank was forced to close its doors. Similar fear spread to other Heinz banks, and then to the whole banking world. The crash was on.
Morgan interests called loans and refused to grant new ones. Before long, the panic had engulfed America. Thousands of banks were vastly overextended, some having maintained less than 1% reserves. The weaker banks went under first, closing their doors to depositors. Compounding the effect was the fact that the news spread more quickly than ever before, thanks to the new communications technologies. Within days, every bank in the nation was trying to reassure its customers. Many closed their doors and never reopened. Skousen described the effect on the money supply.
Circulating money was hoarded by any who happened to get some. So before long, a viable medium of exchange became practically non-existent. Many business concerns began printing IOUs on small pieces of paper and exchanging these for raw materials, as well as giving them to their workers for wages. These tokens passed around as a temporary medium of exchange.
Now, the American people were really angry. 40 years on the financial roller coaster had worn thin. Americans desperately wanted safe banks that they could entrust with their money. They wanted a stable financial system, and it seemed like Morgan was providing just the opposite. At this critical moment, J.P. Morgan staged a brilliant public relations coup with a very profitable solution. He offered to salvage the last Heinz Bank, the Trust Company of America, if it would sell him their valuable Tennessee Coal and Iron Company for a small fraction of its real value. Although the proposal violated U.S. antitrust laws, the country was so desperate that the deal was still approved by Washington. Morgan then convinced Congress to allow him to circulate $200 million of his own private money. Of course, this token money would be issued by Morgan banks. Morgan said this flow of new money might be just the thing to get the economy moving again. So the plan was approved. Morgan printed $200 million out of literally nothing. He bought things with the new funny money, paid for services with it, and sent it to his branch banks to lend out at interest. It worked. Soon the public had regained confidence in money in general and quit hoarding their currency. By 1908, the panic was over, and Morgan was seen as a hero for saving the nation from a crisis he had not only created but also profited from. As incredible as it may seem, the president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, actually applauded Morgan's efforts.
All this trouble, the 1907 Depression, could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country.
The real purposes for the repeated crashes since the Civil War had been threefold.
To concentrate more of America's rapidly developing wealth into the hands of a super-rich elite by the roller coaster effect, whereby booms and busts generate bankruptcies and foreclosures. To make the independent, decentralized banking system look unstable. And finally, to make people so desperate for monetary security that they would be ready to accept practically any solution, namely the institution of a new central bank. As mainline economics textbooks would later verify, the creation of the Federal Reserve System was a direct effect of the panic of 1907.
It sprang from the panic of 1907. With its alarming epidemic of bank failures, the country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking.
Officially funded public relations campaign in history. The big New York banks, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, etc., contributed to a $5 million educational fund to finance professors at respected universities to endorse the new concept. An organization called the National Citizens League was formed under the personal guidance of Paul Warburg. On April 8, 1912, the New York Times wrote a story passively justifying the enormous funding of the League by the national banks.
$1 million doesn't go very far in a campaign of education such as being carried on by the National Citizens League for the promotion of a sound banking system. Yet the contribution of $1 million for that purpose by individual directors of the national banks of the country a short time ago provoked much comment and a suggestion that the electorate was to be corrupted by the use of these funds.
The New York Times story went on to include sample letters the banks could provide to their best customers to enlist their aid in propagandizing for the League. But there were other initiatives as well. Funding was shuttled to the emerging schools of economics around the nation. As Gail Braith explained it,
under Aldrich's direction, a score or more of studies of monetary institutions in the United States, and more particularly in other countries, were commissioned from the emergent economics profession. It is at least possible that the reverence in which the Federal Reserve System has since been held by economists owes something to the circumstance that so many who pioneered in the profession participated also in its birth.
Heading up the League's propaganda was J. Lawrence Laughlin, a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. Congressman Lindbergh commented on the school's connection to the money trust.
The University of Chicago is an institution endowed by John D. Rockefeller with nearly $50 million. It may truly be said to be the Rockefeller University.
So in the end, the Peugeot Committee accomplished very little other than to whip up public support for the very reform that the bankers actually wanted, the passage of the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913. Although the bill passed by an overwhelming majority, only 22% of the House members actually remained in Washington to vote on the final bill.
And it was just before Christmas, as you know, and the congressmen, senators had visions of sugar plum fairies, and they were off to their Christmas parties, and didn't take time to even try to understand the ramifications of the legislation, which was the biggest heist in the history of humanity.
Although the bill appeared to spread out power through 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the bill as passed left significant issues to be settled after the Fed actually began operations. In reality, the bill created just another privately owned central bank. The stock would be owned by all the national banks in the country, which in turn would be owned by their private stockholders. The Fed would be no more federal than Federal Express. Furthermore, federal courts have ruled that the Fed is a private corporation. So how did it work out? Did this private corporation, cleverly disguised to look like a public institution pretending to operate in the public interest, save America from the painful booms and busts of the dreaded business cycle? Well, less than 16 years after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act on October 29, 1929, the New York stock market crashed, dragging the rest of the world into the deepest, most long-lasting depression of the 20th century. International trade decreased by 50%. Unemployment in the U.S. rose to 25%, and in some countries as high as 33%. So was it an accident, or was it just that old wascally business cycle acting up again? According to Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, it was deliberate. The Fed could have stopped the Depression at any time by pumping money into the system. But instead, they let the money supply decline by 33%, sending most banks into bankruptcy. Friedman put it this way in his 1996 interview with National Public Radio.
The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933.
I don't think there's ever been a recession or a depression that was necessary. It is because the current system, where nearly all of the money is created as debt, and as debt on which interest has to be paid, is like a system where the bankers blow debt into a balloon, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and things are quite prosperous when they're still blowing the debt in the balloon. And then all of a sudden, the debt burden becomes so great that the system won't carry it. And then it's like a balloon with a pin stuck in it. And things crash, asset values drop. A lot of people lose their homes, their farms, and their jobs, and all unnecessarily.
So long as the Fed is owned by the banks, and the banks are in complete control over the quantity of a national money, and that national money is lent into existence by the banks, guess what? Money can never serve the public interest, and only a system of debt serfdom, worldwide debt serfdom, can possibly result. This is what we have today, and unless we break its stranglehold over the nations of the world, humankind's cherished vision of freedom will be lost forever, and the very existence of humanity itself may be threatened. Today's Fed is nothing but a private monopoly over the nation's money. It pretends to be able to control how much money banks create out of nothing as loans. But as we found out during the 2008 congressional hearings, instead of lending out only 10 times as much money as they actually had, the biggest banks were lending out 50 times as much or more. Why haven't we heard this before? Why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't the root of our economic problems taught in every classroom around the world? Because the three major pathways of truthfully informing the public have been blocked by those who make money off the debt money system. There is now no penalty for a politician selling his soul to bankers. The vast majority of President Obama's top campaign contributors were the biggest banks. The same goes for the Republican nominee in 2012, Mitt Romney. So we need a new crop of politicians who will tell us the truth about how money is created and in whose benefit.
So when it comes to the national debt, you would not have had a national debt if we'd not given the power to create money to the banking sector. You need to take that power to create money back to a public body. So you don't give that power to politicians because they'll abuse it in the same way that the banks have done.
Yesterday, a judge approved the settlement with SAC Capital, a $602 million fine for civil insider trading. One asks whether $602 million fine is likely to have much effect. Of course, that the owner and CEO of SAC Capital took home last year in compensation $1.4 billion personally. So I checked what Stephen A. Cohen, his political engagement this past year, and he gave $217,000 in campaign contributions. Now, this is a pittance from the point of view of his wealth, obviously, as a share of $1.4 billion paycheck. But $217,000 with our cheapskate politicians actually goes a long way to making sure that Mr. Cohen will be very well treated by his senators and by others who are giving ample protection. The financial markets are the #1 campaign contributors in the U.S. system now. We have a corrupt politics to the core, I'm afraid to say. The final point, of course, is separating the politicians from the crooks. But maybe that's so close together that they can't actually be separated. Maybe it's just the same community.
What happens is that ultimately the one who creates money controls the political structure. So if you let the bank to create money for the nation, so over time, you would find the bank will be ultimately controlling the resources and the political structure or power in the country.
Seems strange that that community will stand for that when, with a bit of political will, it could issue its own debt-free money supply.
So how about the economics academic community in the United States? Surely professors of economics have their academic freedom, the continual search for the truth, protected by what's called tenure. Tenure is where a professor can't be fired for their political opinions.
Tenure started around 1900 and worked well for the first 70 years or so. But by the mid-1990s, things had changed. In order to hide the upcoming failings of the old debt money system, the Federal Reserve began a substantial program of consultants, visiting scholars, alumni, and staff economists that today so thoroughly dominates the field of economics that real criticism of the central bank and its debt money system has become a career liability, or when it comes to a reputable economics journal, an impossibility. At the prestigious Journal of Monetary Economics, more than half of the editorial board members are currently on the Fed payroll, and the rest have been in the past. The Fed's Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. employs 220 PhD economists. The 12 regional banks employ scores more. Roger Auerbach, a former investigator with the House Banking Committee, found out that there are only 1,000 to 1,500 monetary economists working in the U.S. today. In 2009, the last year figures were available, the Fed spent $433 million on experts researching monetary and economic policy. If that isn't bad enough, the Fed has all the pathways to all the major economics journals blocked as well. In a recent survey of the 7 top journals, 84 of the 190 editorial board members were affiliated with the Federal Reserve in one way or another. According to Joshua Rosner, a Wall Street analyst who correctly called the 2008 meltdown,
the Fed has a lock on the economics world. There is no room for other views. The only way you can actually get in a journal is by subscribing to the views of one of the journals.
But it's not all about the money either. When you are an up-and-coming economist trying to gain tenure at a university, the prestige of being associated with the Fed in one way or another is an absolute necessity. According to Jane Darista, a Fed critic and an economist with the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst,
it's very important, if you are on a tenure track and don't have tenure, to show that you are valued by the Federal Reserve.
Academics that do research, warning of a banking crisis, get told, well, we may have to fire you because our funding was cut by 80% and professors' jobs aren't safe. You have to change your research or we can't have you anymore at the university. And that's quite shocking, isn't it?
There is a reluctance or even a denial that there is a problem with the monetary system. And it's at the time it's only a few academic experts who are willing to concede that there might be some problem with the money system.
So what is the media message? What is the media telling the public? The media tells the public that the problem is that the government is printing too much money. You hear it over and over every day on the news. But it's not. It would not be nearly so bad if that was really the problem.
We aren't printing money. We are borrowing every dollar into existence. And worse, borrowing it at interest.
So isn't the media supposed to be the keepers of the public interest, the fourth estate? Not anymore. Here's a story I was told a couple of years ago. When I released my last documentary, The Secret of Oz, at the end of 2009, I sent it to 2 friends of mine in the media. They worked at one of the big 3 U.S. networks. One was the president of the network, and the other, my oldest friend in the media business, was his executive producer. After viewing the film, they called me and said, "This is great." I was puzzled. I'd expected that they would dismiss it as some sort of economic conspiracy theory. But they told me that they had just been laid off with 100 other network executives because of J.P. Morgan. I asked what J.P. Morgan had to do with the network, and they said that the networks are so heavily in debt to Morgan that every time loans come due, J.P. Morgan efficiency experts make demands on what the network has to do to have its loans renewed. What would be the price for non-compliance? The network would be out of business in a single week. So it's just like the average American homeowner. They are all mortgaged to the max to banks. Anything the bank says, they have to do. Just as the Bible says in Proverbs.
Just as the rich rule over the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender.
So do you really have to ask why the general public is confused? If our politicians can't tell us the truth, and the media can't dare to tell us the truth, then even the professors can't tell us the truth. What is the average person supposed to believe, and how can they ever discover the truth, much less sort it out from the conflicting diversions?
What I found, though, when you talk about things like monetary policy, economic policies, yes, you can state the truth, the public will understand it, but you'll immediately get official expert come out and say, oh, it's not so simple. It's more complex than that. And clearly there seems to be this belief among economists that a complex theory, lots of abstract mathematics, because it must be cleverer, is intellectually superior to a simple argument. The truth couldn't be further from it, because it's a fundamental principle in logic known to Aristotle and William of Ockham, who said, very truthfully, that a simple argument beats a complex argument.
So what do we do about this? Fortunately, the solution is easy to understand, and it's basically the same for every nation on earth. All monetary reformers agree that fractional reserve lending is nothing but outright theft and must be stopped. Some believe that no interest is justified at all, that all interest is usury and has been condemned for centuries by both the Christian and Muslim faiths.
The Quran uses the term riba for what Western people would have understood as usury, except that sometimes the definition of usury would be exorbitant usury, and that there was an acceptable amount of usury that would not be condemned, but not in Islam.
I cannot see why the banking sector should have the privilege of creating money and the government being forced to borrow from the banks at interest.
Remember, the bank isn't actually loaning real money. It is simply adding some numbers to an account. In exchange, the borrower agrees to repay this loan with compounding interest. But where does the interest money come from? Well, you either have to take it from someone else, reducing their ability to service their interest-bearing loans, or you have to take out another loan to repay your existing loan. In other words, this system creates a global Ponzi scheme based on ever-increasing levels of debt.
The mountain of debt is worldwide. It can't be serviced. I think that we're on the verge of a very, very serious trauma.
In 2007, just before the crisis started, the UK national debt was about £500 billion. And in that time, we'd already spent £700 billion on paying the interest. So we paid more interest than was actually outstanding, than we'd ever borrowed. We have a financial and monetary system where taxpayers will be on the hook for the mistakes of the banking sector, even though the system was designed so badly that those mistakes are inevitable.
The supply chain is going to break down. The real economy is going to break down, and there's going to be scarcities. And it's going to be horrible.
At some point, this system absolutely must collapse into a titanic pile of bankruptcies and poverty for the masses, and all the real assets will be owned by the banks and their stockholders. How should money be created? First of all, government should create all the money it needs to operate debt-free. Inflation should be monitored closely, just as is done today in Guernsey. And if too much money is created and prices start to edge up, then money is taken out of the system by taxation. Taxation should no longer be seen as a source of government revenue. The government can create all the money it needs to fund its spending requirements. Millions of people die worldwide from hunger. These deaths could be eliminated in a single year. More millions die of contaminated water supplies. All of these deaths could be eliminated in a few years. Millions more die of lack of simple medical care. Most of these deaths could be eliminated in a decade once the proper medical infrastructure was built and physicians were trained in every nation. So then the question is, are we trying to create some impossible social utopia? No. Another responsibility of government, once basic needs are met, is to stimulate individual productivity. This can be done by making sufficient money available to the banking section so that they can lend money to anyone who works hard, repays their debts, and has a good idea. Then each person can decide whether they wish to live modestly or whether they want to try to better themselves through working hard and creating products and services the world needs. The question is, should the National Treasury lend out to the people directly? Probably not. You probably want to create competition among commercial banks for the commercial lending business. That will foster competition and ensure that Treasury cannot deny a person a loan because they don't like their politics. National money would be sold by the nation's treasury to banks or states or cities. It would be a simple transaction. Let's say $100 would be sold to a bank for $101. Banks would then tack on their own initiation fee and lend it out to people. If you have banks lending to individuals, then there will be liberal-leaning banks and conservative-leaning banks. Power will be split up. That ensures a more stable, democratic environment. Of course, private lenders could also form banks and use their own money instead of buying it from the government.
In the new organization, due to the monetary reform, the money creation is no longer in the hands of the banks.
Although there are differing opinions over the precise implementation of monetary reform, all money reformers agree on certain basic principles. Number one, forbid national borrowing.
It just doesn't make any sense at all that a government should have to borrow something for which they own the patent and have the right to produce themselves. It's in their own domain. They have the power. The problem is they just don't use it. And why is the $64 trillion question.
So a nation state, why should it not, in the public interest, in the interest of its citizens, create its own debt-free, persistently circulating money supply? Why not? Instead of having to borrow it from commercial bankers.
So instead of allowing banks to create money and put it into the property markets and financial speculation, we have the state creating money in the public interest and making sure that money gets into the real economy where it can create jobs and actually create wealth.
So once you understand what money is, that is your natural resources, you need something to measure it. It's just information, you see. So you don't borrow information and pay interest on that.
Sovereign nations do not have to borrow. The borrower becomes servant to the lender. And in the case of nations, the lenders are usually the biggest banks or related financial institutions.
If we continue with business as usual and so to say small modifications as it is done today, that will end up over and over again, that will end up in some sort of financial crisis.
Number two, all nations need to issue their own debt-free sovereign currency once again and put an end to consolidated currencies like the euro. Nations can create enough of their own national money to serve the public interest. The argument against this is that it will cause hyperinflation. My answer, not if you control the quantity. If controlling the quantity is the only thing we have to do to get out of this mess, don't you think we can find somebody to do that?
As to the German experience of hyperinflation in the early 20s, it's not true that was caused by the government, because the government had no say at all in monetary policy at the time. That was actually an Allied commission, and the people who had the say in that commission were private bankers, particularly from the United Kingdom and from the United States. And the government had no say in it. So this is a myth.
Here's my axiom. It matters not what backs the money. All that matters is who controls the quantity. Will you be in control of the quantity in the public interest, or will you give that power up again to bankers who will, by definition, have to maximize profits for their corporation? Another argument is that government is too corrupt to control the quantity of money. My response is, government is all we have. You can't elect a banker in any nation on this planet. Right now, the money power has taken over government. The solution is not to give up on government. The bankers love to promote that solution. Our only option is to fight to take government back, to make it serve the public interest. And the most important weapon to break out of the debt money system is to forbid government borrowing. The argument against debt-free national money is that it will reduce the standard of living through debased currency. But history is full of the folly of trying to tie the money supply to gold. Let the value of a nation's currency float on the international market. That's the natural, truly free market solution. Each nation's sovereign money will find its own level, and that should be based solely on that nation's productivity. The only reduction in the standard of living will be a reduction in a nation's ability to import products. But the upside will be to massively stimulate internal production of every product a nation needs. For example, Greece would start building television sets and refrigerators because it couldn't afford to buy them off ships from China. In other words, within a single year, every nation that reissues debt-free sovereign money will be well on their way to a robust recovery and a sustainable recovery, because then their internal production of everything the nation consumes will be stimulated massively. The result? The accumulation of real national wealth through national production. This is the only escape from the bankers' debt money system. Number 3. Forbid fractional reserve lending.
Under prevailing circumstances of fractional reserve banking, there is no smooth way out. We have had more than 400 systemic financial crises across the world throughout the last 30 years, and very certainly there will be a next crisis and another one, if not, and so I can't imagine it will go on forever like this.
It develops into such a heavy debt load that it reaches a point where the system and the people just can't bear it. Having a system where there is so much debt on which they have to spend such a large proportion of their income to pay the interest.
As Milton Friedman rightly said, it is inherently a fragile institution that is subject to self-fulfilling collapse.
We need banks. They provide useful services that people need and are willing to pay for. We don't need to nationalize banks. We do need a healthy competition between them to ensure our future economic freedom and a robust, competitive environment for those who wish to compete to better themselves and their families. The money masters have ruled this planet for thousands of years through serfdom and slavery. Humanity's answer to this problem has been to institute self-governance. That's been the cornerstone of humans' march into freedom. The problem is that the money masters have learned how to recapture the most important power of self-governance while leaving the shell to make it look like we are still free, but we're not.
What we need to do is to give back the power back to the people. So that's why, as you can see, I say unriba, undo. We have to undo the effects of the ribawi system, yes.
The important thing is to regain control, and to regain also control of the creation of money, and in that way also to regain the benefit from creating money, which is a privilege.
Until we learn that the root of our freedom problem is government borrowing, we will never return to true government of, by, and for the people.
The truth is simple enough for the average person out there to understand, and that's especially true when it comes to things like money.
The situation today is unusual. There are solutions, and trust people who have different ideas. Don't be afraid of people who are suggesting something you've never heard before.
Why should a government borrow when it can create its own money? And don't fall into the false solution that becoming involved in massive transnational governments will solve the problems. That just makes self-governance even more impossible. It puts you farther away from being able to fix this problem. Remember, that's what the money masters want. They want you to feel like you don't have a voice. They want you to give up. They want total control.
It is really important for the general public to be aware that actually the truth is simple and they shouldn't give up, they should look into it.
Personally, I'm convinced that such a reform that will happen sooner or later, it's clearly one of the next steps to be taken.
And in the United States, this is the 100th anniversary of that Federal Reserve System, which has been nothing but trouble since it was first passed into law 100 years ago. And this is a year when the American people could give themselves the most wonderful present ever to get rid of it, to repeal the legislation and to establish a proper Bank of the United States owned not by the banks, but by the people.
And I found very often discussing with experts, discussing with taxi drivers and people, from all sorts of walks of life, usually the experts are very confused. And the common sense of the people is, in my experience, actually far closer to the truth than the complex arguments of the experts. So don't give up, I would say.
It's just that simple. You can understand this problem and fix it.
In conclusion, it has become painfully obvious, even for me, a 12-year-old Canadian, that we are being defrauded and robbed by the banking system and a complicit government. What will we do to stop this crime? What will we do to ensure that the next generation will live free and clear of the debt-based economy that enslaves them to the banks? Margaret Mead said the following, and I hope that all of you remember this. Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.